We're live. Welcome everyone to our end of the year recap, end of season recap. How you doing, Riley? How's the end of the year treating you? End of the basketball year.
Well, it's going well, Scott. It's been busy, a lot of travel as I write this book on D3 basketball, getting ready to head to Fort Wayne to the men's D3 Final Four tomorrow. But it's been a lot of fun. I mean, this entire tournament on the women's side has been super exciting. It's certainly lived up to the hype. Each and every one of these, pods and sectionals this last weekend was a lot of fun. I mean, I think we've seen some upsets, some surprises. It's been, I think we've seen what we expected, right? A lot of parity, it seems like, and even if in a lot of cases the favorites did emerge from some of those pods in the first weekend, especially and into the second weekend, we still saw some surprises within those, and so yeah, it's been a lot of fun, and I think can't wait for this Final Four because really there's no clear favorite at this point. Though I think NYU comes in as the prevailing team that we certainly have our eyes on.
Yeah, it should be a great Final Four. I didn't realize it kicked off on Thursday instead of Friday, but so I will be prepared come Thursday. But I think we'll hit all of our fun topics in our slides. So let's just jump right in. We're going to hit the NCAA tournament. Thoughts on that, then talk about, looks like I've got these out of order, but they will be in order once we get to them. Second, we'll talk about committee trends as it relates to regional rankings and Pool C and bracketing. Then we'll hit the year in stats, as I love to talk about. And then finally, we will look ahead to next year. But I snuck in a fifth topic, starting off at 0 here, with yearly themes. I wanted to touch on a few things that I saw maybe be different. I obviously haven't followed Division III women's basketball for crazy long, really just closely for about 3 years now. But some of the themes that I looked at are parity and depth. It really seemed like the teams in the 50 to 125 range or 60 to 100 range were way more capable of beating teams above them than we've seen in past years. And that led to a lot fewer undefeated teams, a lot more teams with 3, 4, 5 losses than I was really expecting. But I think it made for great basketball when some of that kind of middle class of quality is really building up and a lot stronger than it was before.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I think we've seen that in a lot of conferences too, where it feels like conferences are deeper than ever. 3, 4, 5 teams deep, especially heading to those conference tournaments. There were several leagues where we knew that most likely, the league was going to get 2, maybe 3 bids in the NCAA tournament, but there were 4 or 5 teams that we thought were capable to some degree of winning that entire league tournament. And I think that's a testament, to the recruiting. I mean, talking with some coaches, one of the things that they seem to have found is that, players more so now than ever are tending to stay closer to home. And I think what we're seeing there is that a lot of these programs across Division III are maybe picking up some more of these local kids. And as a result, the talent in a lot of these leagues is being spread out a little bit further than it was in past years. And so seeing that has just made a lot of these conferences that much better, especially in situations where they're pretty regional. A lot of the schools are closer together and they're recruiting against each other. It seems like in more cases now, we're seeing, all league, all region type performers on several teams. And the NCAC comes to mind, honestly, as a league that really showed this year. I thought they took some steps forwards. A lot of really, really quality teams there, and teams that honestly could be very much in the mix again next year. There were teams that should be returning a couple, if not, 4 or 5 of their starters for next season. So that's an interesting element of things that I think certainly has stood out over the last year or two to me.
Yeah, the recruiting side of it is something that I know almost nothing about. And it is really interesting to hear your thoughts on changes that we're seeing in recruiting. And I think there's all kinds of changes in the collegiate landscape, both
Right.
academically, financially, demographically, and athletically, that impact Division III sports. Continued theme of this year's fifth years having just a really, really large impact when a team can just add back, not add back, when a team can add like Sophia Rosa or Christina Antonikakis, if I got it correct.
I think that's
Antonia
right.
Kakis. It can flip, not flip, but it can drastically change where a team is at. Like both of those teams would probably be quality teams without the players that they have. But when you move them up 20, 30, 40 spots because of adding such a high caliber player, it's a big deal that happens all of a sudden.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think prime example and maybe an overused example this season, but NYU is a team that really built well with some of those grad transfers. And the thing that I think is worth noting here is that the grad transfers that have really stood out. It says a lot about that player. I think it says a lot about the program. It's tough to bring in a player who's only going to be there for a year, get them up to speed with the system, and get them into a role really quickly where they're playing quality minutes from the get-go. Just because, in Division III, even with the couple extra days of practice that teams had this year, it's still not a lot of time to get someone brand new into, the mix. And yet we saw several programs this year really, add grad transfers that made impacts for them. And this window of the fifth year is winding to a close as we head into next season. But for the time being, I think it's really been a way for some of these programs to just build a little bit more, and bring in experience, especially for some of these younger teams, bringing out a player that's been around Division III, been, in some cases been in these leagues before, but also just been at the college level. And I think that's at the bottom line is, bringing out a player that has that level of experience, that has played somewhere for 4 years previously. They have the basketball IQ at that point to come in and learn the system and really step in quickly. So yeah, it's been interesting. Again, it goes back to the recruiting side of things, and certainly there's been programs who have been able to take advantage of it more than others, with the grad programs that individual institution might have. But for those who can utilize it, it's been very beneficial, certainly.
And what's coming is a switch away from fifth years, and it'll be interesting to see which programs are set up to handle losing so much talent. I look at Hope, who traditionally would run, their starters would play about half the minutes. The second team would play about a third of the minutes, and their third team would still play, what's that, a sixth of the
Yeah.
minutes?
Yep.
And so every single year, that's building up, building up. So whenever they needed to graduate a class, the incoming class had played way more minutes than most of their opponents. Well, then we get fifth years, and Hope gets to keep Olivia Voskel, Kennedy Schooneveld, and Kate Majerus for a fifth year over 2 years. And they took in a nice way those minutes from the upcoming secondary and third line players, so that when they became starters, they had way fewer career minutes than typical Hope starters. And Hope is still very good this year, but I think that's something that's going to hit every program that is giving minutes to fifth years. Is the returning players might all have fewer career experience than they otherwise would have. When sure, you see ebbs and flows in the team. Is a team equally distributed between seniors, juniors, sophomores, and freshmen, or do they have some sort of imbalance? But even within an imbalance, there were more minutes to go around for the up and comers, and I bet you some schools are better set up to handle losing all of that talent than others.
Absolutely. I think the point I would also add to that is the fact that we're in an interesting time heading into next season where players that came in as freshmen during the what would that be, the 21-22 season. Um, they don't have the benefit of that COVID year, right? So they're a senior next year. They're a true senior, and it'll be their, you know, obviously there's caveats with players who have medical red shirts and those kinds of things, but in almost every case, a player who's a true senior next year will be graduating. So not only will you have programs losing their fifth years, but now you also have a bunch of seniors leaving these programs. So there's going to be a pretty significant drop off for some of these programs where they're going to lose not only maybe their starting five, but maybe, their a couple of their top two, maybe three bench players as well. Those are big, big losses. And so, yeah, to your point, I mean, there's going to be programs that are better equipped to handle this than others. And honestly, the programs that haven't been able to take advantage of the fifth years quite as much because maybe a lack of grad programs or whatever it might be, they've had to continue to recruit freshmen and high schoolers coming in as freshmen. Those programs, in my opinion, may be better set up because they're in a point where they haven't necessarily built all the way through the grad transfers. Now, every program in Division III, from my standpoint, has done that to some degree. Some have gone after the transfers more than others, but I think the point being, next year you're going to be losing probably more than you would in any other year, and that would be across the board. I can think of 4 or 5 programs right now that are going to be really good next year, and the year after that, there's going to be some serious inexperience. Doesn't mean there's a lack of talent, but just inexperience on their rosters. So that'll be a storyline to keep an eye on.
Absolutely. And it reminds me of Hardin Simmons, who graduated a ton of talent before this year, but then were able to add Anna Finelli and Mary Jo Parker as transfers to kind of replace a lot of that talent. And that ability will be going away for programs starting in the 2025, 2026 season.
Right.
And then I also saw some maybe trends in play style. Now, my basketball background is very small. I think it started and ended when I was 10. I played as a deep bench backup where my high point was being subbed into a game and fouling out in about 10 minutes on the floor. So I do not have a strong basketball playing pedigree, but there are definitely some trends that I saw this year compared to last year. One was the restricted area was removed or made smaller. So the arc is no longer a thing. There's still a restricted area more or less directly under the hoop, which gives a little extra advantage to the offense, or relative advantage to the offense. I saw a lot of defenses play a step off of guards, where there are very few guards who have the quickness to dribble drive past a defender when their defender is giving them a foot or two of cushion. And that was a really prevalent defensive strategy. I saw teams take a lot more threes. I don't know if that was response to that strategy or just a continued embracement. Is that the word? Of what analytics say,
Yeah.
all of the NBA and Division I and men's basketball shoot way more threes than they did years and decades ago. And that is definitely coming to the women's game. Because of that, there's a decreased mid-range game because you only have so many shots. You're just reallocating where your shots go. And I wonder if, because there's more threes being taken or longer shots, that there's longer rebounds and more offensive rebounds. Because one thing I was noting is that in Division III, women's basketball, the players are shorter than their male counterparts, and they can't jump as high. And so it seems like the positive effect of a successful box out can be really decreased when the ball just bounces out of your area. Even if you successfully won a box out, if it's a 3 and is kind of a long rebound or on average a longer rebound than years before, there's a lot more opportunity for the offense to get offensive rebounds, and not because the defense is doing a poor job defensive rebounding. And I don't know if that reality almost encourages more threes because there's less of a penalty for missing than there would be in, say, the NBA.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, that's all completely well said, and I'd agree with all that. I mean, it's because yeah, I saw it too, and I think, you know, even when you're looking just at the way that basketball is being played now, I mean, I think across the board, there's a lot more threes that are being taken, and a lot fewer guards, honestly, who are taking the mid-range shots, which makes players who are really good at the mid-range a little bit more rare and maybe even tougher for some defenses to guard based on, you know, the way some defenses are set up, because again, defenses are now getting to a place where they need to defend that 3-point line a little bit more, um, because it's, you know, it's an area of strength for a lot of programs now. And so as a result, you know, players that can hit those mid-range shots, and honestly against zone defenses you can see this sometimes, you know, those players tend to be pretty valuable. But also, I would say the offensive rebounding is interesting. Murray Schleissner from Washington Lee, I think what was so impressive about watching her play, and obviously her height is certainly a big aspect of that. But you know, she's so good on the defensive end with taking away offensive rebounding opportunities, even on the longer offensive boards. I think that's why Washington Lee honestly was really solid throughout this tournament, because they, you know, they didn't give up a whole lot of offensive rebounds. Now, there were certainly cases, and even through the regular season, where there was high offensive rebound numbers against them. But I think for the most part, if you can keep a team off the boards now, because you know what I've seen is a lot of, you know, those long threes, but then teams getting the offensive rebound, kicking it back out for another three, right? And so those are the types of things that teams are really looking for, those 3-point shots now. And it's going to be interesting in years to come, kind of seeing how the game continues to progress, and also how the defensive strategies try to respond to that. Because I don't foresee us going back to fewer threes being taken. I think if anything, we're going to end up seeing more, because as you pointed out, I mean, the analytics are pointing to the fact that taking a 3-point shot in a lot of cases is going to be more valuable and a better opportunity for you than taking a long two.
Yeah, I was really struck by the offensive rebounds while watching Wisconsin Stout play Transylvania in that was the Sweet 16, where Stout gave up 5 offensive rebounds on the first Transylvania possession, and
Yep.
Transylvania gave up a lot of offensive rebounds in the second half. And it didn't seem to me like it was just really bad rebounding. It just
Right.
seemed like the rebounds didn't just kind of fell elsewhere.
Yeah.
And it, yeah, it seemed pretty stark. But those are some themes for the year. So getting into the our first real topic was the NCAA tournament. Unfortunately, it looks like I cannot tab through all of my bullets one by one. So you're just going to see all of it as it appears. But some of my best surprises and performances right up top was Smith. I think Smith was a great team last year, but I did not think they were going to be able to replicate what they were doing without Morris and Pakukna. And even though they added Sophia Rosa. And then throughout the year, they won a ton of games, but they didn't play a ton of really top teams. And I think, did they lose to Springfield once?
I believe so. Yeah, I'll double check that, but I believe you're right on that.
And so for a bulk of the year, Smith and Springfield had very similar looking performances. And I was like, maybe Smith ends up being a team that can win a couple games in the NCAA tournament. Maybe they lose in the second round. I don't really know. And clearly, they're a very solid team who has won a lot in the NCAA tournament and away from home. And I think they've been great.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and I think that's been a big thing, honestly. You know, one of the things that I was really impressed with watching them, and I noted it actually in the national semifinal preview I put out on my newsletter not too long ago. Smith is one of the most efficient offenses in the country, and that's been impressive to me because, you know, I honestly I didn't know how good they were. Maybe looking at it, having watched them through the regular season, I think I expected they would win at least a tournament game. But to reach this point and win the way that they have, it's been a combination of some really efficient offensive performances, but also some really strong defense. And I mean, you just look at the way that they played Bowdoin. I thought that was a defensive clinic from Smith. And what's interesting about Smith is that, they don't tend to turnover teams a lot. And they also don't have a ton of steals or blocks. They're not super strong in either of those categories. They're solid, but not incredibly strong. But I think what they do so well is they just defend that 3-point arc. They don't give up many threes in most cases. Now, Wisconsin Oshkosh certainly found a way to change that and hit 11 threes against them. But outside of that, Smith has been really good at just staying in front of the ball handler and not giving up easy shots. And I think at the end of the day, Smith is here because of a really strong defensive performance against Bowdoin, in which Sidney Jones only had 6 points in that game for Bowdoin. Like, those are some things that really stuck out to me through this tournament run so far from Smith, and what they've been able to put together again without Morgan Morrison there and some question marks entering this season. I think they've proven they're just fine.
Yeah, and Wartburg is a lot of the similar story for me, where they absolutely won a ton of games this year, didn't play a ton of really top teams throughout the year. And whenever Wartburg played Loras, like, I think a lot of Loras, but all of those games were very close. And so Wartburg didn't have a lot of these really big wins where I was like, yeah, I want to put them in my top 5. But there was no way I don't want to say this. I was going to say I wasn't going to put them outside of my top 15, but I don't know if I did rank them outside of my top 15 at parts in the year. But I'm wondering if Smith and Wartburg just had really like unvarying performances. Like, maybe their highs are less high than we might see from other teams, but their lows are not low at all. And in the NCAA tournament, that sort of middle of the road is not the right word, but like, if you can produce your average performance, then I think you can win a lot of games. I remember my dad talking to me about baseball teams, that if a baseball team scored their average number of runs every game, they would win like 135 games. Because your average just comes from a lot of like low run games and then some 16 run games. And I wonder if there's something similar in basketball, where you rarely are going to get a bad night from Smith or Wartburg, even if you don't have them beat Loras by 20 on the road or something.
Right.
Any thoughts on Wartburg?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point there, because again, I mean, the records that both these teams have put up, they're very consistent. And if anything, I think the knock that I had was again, like, they weren't beating teams by a lot. There wasn't a lot of super convincing performances, right? And we knew they were good, but it's hard to know how good in the regular season with the conference schedules that they play and all that. But I think what we've seen is, again, that Wartburg showed up and they were able to put up some really strong performances. And again, they won games. And what I think I would point out is that their execution in late in game situations, they're a team of several seniors leading the way there. And they have a lot of experience. Obviously, last year with the run that they made, getting past Hope in a huge game there, they've talked a lot about how beneficial that win was, how beneficial it was playing Christopher Newport in the Sweet 16. And they lost by 9 in that one, but I think they took away a lot of things from it. And I think what we saw this year was a Wartburg team that executed really well late in games, because you look at the Illinois Wesleyan game, you look at the Bates win. I mean, both of those, very recently, I think showed us that Wartburg's a team that they, they can come up with a stop when they need to. They can, come up with a bucket when they need to. And more than anything, they've been right there all year. But my thought heading into the tournament was, I just didn't know quite how well they would match up at Illinois Wesleyan or with the Bates. They're different playing styles that they're facing here. And same thing with Washington Lee, right? Like, they've been able to adapt really well. And the adaptability for me with Wartburg, from what I've seen the last couple of weeks, has been probably the biggest thing that stuck out. They can push the ball in transition when they need to, but they can also control the pace when they need to. That's very valuable in a team in the NCAA tournament when you're playing teams of very different styles on back-to-back days in some cases. And for a Wartburg team that has a lot of experience on its roster, I think those two things kind of go hand in hand with having been here before and be able to adapt to what your opponent's doing, what you need to do from a game planning standpoint to get the win.
Yeah. Another great set of performances out of Mary Sliessner. Just crazy numbers, often very efficient as well.
Yeah.
Shooting well from the free throw line as a post player, just kind of all of it. It's been very fun to watch.
Yeah, I mean, you hit it right there. She's not taking a lot of shots per game. I mean, she's taking a high number, but she's making a lot. Like, her field goal percentage, her efficiency are really solid, and especially in the NCAA tournament where you're facing some really quality teams. And I mean, it was just impressive to watch how well she played. And again, that's offensively, that's defensively. I thought she did a lot of great things defensively that maybe didn't show up as much on the box score as her points and that kind of thing. But I talked about it earlier. The rebounding was huge. I mean, the defensive rebounds, I thought, took away a lot of second chance opportunities for their opponents. I mean, Washington Lee, limited the offensive rebounds to a degree, and a lot of it was Sliessner. That again, I mean, that'll win you games in the NCAA tournament. And I mean, to the point about Wartburg, I think Wartburg was really the only team in the tournament that even remotely slowed her down. I mean, they did well in the first half, and I think that gave them some breathing room, some separation, even as Washington Lee started to make a comeback in the second half. So, yeah, I mean, just impressive. I really honestly don't see how she's not National Player of the Year. She was very consistent throughout the course of this season. And it seemed like you got to the point every night you were expecting a 20-point, 20 rebound type performance from her. And I mean, she's just a special player for this level, especially. You don't see a lot of post players in Division III putting up these kinds of numbers. And there's a lot of great post players in Division III. So that's a huge, I think she separated herself in a big way, even with a lot of talent. And again, Washington Lee has a great backcourt too. Like, it wasn't just her, but she did a lot to help propel that run.
Mm-hmm. And then I loved seeing schools that hosted opening weekend pods that maybe haven't hosted one super recently, but I remember seeing how cool Bowdoin looked, and Bates and Carroll and Hardin Simmons were the four that came to mind. I know Carroll let in students free, so that place was full of energy. Bowdoin and Bates are always full of energy. I'm also reminded of Keene State on the men's side. I think had really cool posters, kind of movie premiere style posters for each of the four teams in the pods. I think it's really cool when a host goes all out to make it a really cool experience for everyone attending and everyone participating.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's what you expect of the NCAA tournament. And it was cool just tuning into the different games across the country. I mean, Carroll, I mean, everyone was right up next to the baseline, in their student section. It was from the people that were there that I've talked to said it was such a loud environment, a lot of fun to just see how much, the Carroll student section, the Carroll alumni base, just the fan base, the community was invested in that whole sectional, or that pod, I should say, first weekend. And then, too, like you talked about Hardin Simmons. Hardin Simmons did something similar, let a lot of students in with their student IDs. That was a great environment, great, place to be. They played Trinity in the second round, and it was so loud in there. I mean, those are the kinds of moments that I think as student athletes, as coaches, you're going to remember from being part of the NCAA tournament. That's what you picture when you think of kind of punching your ticket to March. And so, yeah, really cool to see, these schools just kind of going all out, making this the big deal that it really is. And really, again, understanding the responsibility in hosting too, because, it's certainly not easy, but a lot of schools are willing to put the time, the effort in to make it a very memorable thing for all involved.
And when we talk about committee trends, we'll talk about bracketing and some of the hosting decisions that they made that will relate to that. This next slide is worst performances, which is probably too harsh, but obviously some teams had a more disappointing tournament than they were probably hoping for. I was surprised to see Springfield lose to Widener in the opening round. Widener was definitely playing great basketball at the end of the year, a tough matchup to get. But Springfield also seemed like they were playing strong basketball all year. I was surprised to see them lose their first game. I'm going to go through all 5 quick, Riley, and then you can talk to any of them that you'd like to talk about. Rhode Island College was a really dominant team throughout the whole year. They beat up Gustavus Adolphus pretty badly. And so I was surprised to see them struggle the way that they did against Washington and Lee. Washington Lee was obviously playing great, but I thought that Rhode Island College had enough talent and diversified talent that they would be able to withstand Washington and Lee. But they ultimately were not. And they were kind of behind by a decent amount for most of that game. Christopher Newport might fall kind of into the Wartburg and Smith camps where they won a ton all year. They did not play as strong of a schedule as they have in years past. And so I was a little bit unsure what they were. They definitely had injuries as well, but probably a little bit disappointing for them to lose in, was it the round of 32 that they lost to Johns Hopkins, or was it the round of 16?
For Christopher Newport?
Yeah.
Yeah, they lost. Go ahead.
Was it the round of 16?
They lost in the round of 32.
The round of 32.
Yeah.
And Hopkins is another team that maybe they had a really close variance of performances, and they definitely put together a good one to take down Christopher Newport. And then DePauw Emory, I'm going to use as an example just a little bit because both of them had a lot of RRO opportunities and got a lot of RRO wins. And I don't think both of them did very well in the tournament and didn't look particularly good. And so it might be that there's a lot of team, like, sure, I know why we have RROs. Like, we're trying to say, hey, we know what your SOS is, but maybe it's low. Did you beat some good teams? Maybe it's high. Did you only lose to good teams? Like, we want to have some individual game results. Did you beat good opponents? But there might be a lot of teams above DePauw Emory, resume-wise, that just had fewer RO opportunities and would absolutely have won as many as those teams did. And yeah, I mean, it's hard to take Hope at DePauw as the litmus test of that, but Hope did not have many RO opportunities and were leading pretty comfortably for most of that game. Now, up until the final regional rankings, the committee had Hope ahead. And so they obviously had them very, very close. And I'm struggling to think in Region 6 if Emory, I think it was really just Emory, Christopher Newport, and Washington and Lee up top. So no real interesting comparison there. But maybe to Washington and Lee, who had, I would imagine, a lower SOS and lower VRO results. But I think we definitely saw on the men's side that they treat RROs very strongly. I hesitate to say as its own category, or because we don't know. There's 5 primary criteria, and the committee is not. It is not dictated to them if they are all equally or definitely unequally, or if so, how much. But I do think we want a better way to validate like a team's winning percentage against, was it a strong or a weak schedule? And the SOS and the VROs both have shortcomings that let us do that. I do think the committee did a very consistent job applying the criteria that they that is the only criteria they have to use. But I think in cases like DePauw Emory, maybe their basketball team was worse than their resume was.
Right. And I mean, we could spend a whole thing discussing this just because I think there's a lot of debate. I mean, it's been kind of constant over, not only this season, but over a couple of years, just in the sense that the ROs reward the teams that play in the stronger conferences, obviously, because again, you're playing tougher teams there, right? But in in a lot of ways, I think sometimes the high RO numbers is just the indication you're in a good conference. Versus again, as you talked about, I mean, there's plenty of teams that they can only schedule 5 or 6 non-conference games, so they try to schedule as strong as they can. But they're not going to get a ton of RO opportunities in conference play. So as a result, their RO numbers are always going to be lower than say an Emory, who in the UAA, and again we can get into all that, but the UAA, everyone in a different region for the most part. There's a benefit there, right? Because you can have most every conference isn't going to have as many regionally ranked teams as the UAA is going to have, just by design, by the way it's set up. Um, and so yeah, it's an interesting thing to see kind of these teams with a lot of ROs and their tournament performance. It's hard to know, but I think the trend we've seen, at least on the men's side, the UAAs haven't done particularly well, and some of those high RO teams haven't always performed quite to the level we would expect. But at the same time, there's teams that play in, say, the ODAC on the men's side, right? And we got 2 ODAC teams in the men's Final Four right now, so it's hard to kind of gauge it. But yeah, I think you bring up a really good point there that moving forwards, I think the committee is doing the best that they can with the criteria that's been laid out. But it would be nice to have a better way to evaluate things, because again, I think just it's tough to grade these teams that, yeah, again, maybe play in a little bit of a weaker conference, but are just as good, if not better. They're in a lot of cases struggling to be ranked as high as a team with a lot of RO wins or just RO results. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a good point there.
Any thoughts on disappointments in the NCAA tournament, or should we move on?
Yeah, I would just throw in, I think Rhode Island College, if there was an upset, if you had to pick the top upset, it had to be Washington Lee taking down Rhode Island College, because I really thought Rhode Island College was the team that was going to make it to the Final Four this year. When we saw them do it last year, it seemed like everything was lined up for them again this year, just with the talent, everyone that they brought back. So certainly a disappointment there for Rhode Island College, and a team that, I don't know exactly on their returning numbers for next year and how things are looking there, but it'd be interesting to follow them into next year, because I do know they're going to graduate some, if memory serves.
Continuing on with the NCAA tournament, we will look at the best conference performances. So this is win-loss and win percentage, and then points. And points is graded or assigned like a lot of the NCAA bracket challenges, where you get 1 point for a first round win, 2 points for second round win, 4, 8, or 1, 2, 4, 8. So like the NESCAC, Bowdoin and Bates obviously had great tournaments. The HCAC and the ARC and the UAA are really led by their top team that is still alive. The WIAC had 3 teams in the Sweet 16. Little East and Landmark were really led by their top teams as well. But then some of these other conferences here had it. Most of them had at least 2 teams get a win, I think.
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, largely these are the conferences that we know are strong. It's obviously a little bit distorted since a team like Transylvania or NYU making it this far can be towards the top of the list in points.
Yeah.
But the NESCAC definitely stands out. I knew Bowdoin and Bates were good. They absolutely had strong resumes. I would not have been surprised to see either of them lose in the Sweet 16. Probably surprised if they would lose before that, but they have exceeded my expectations for them.
Absolutely. Yeah, I thought that they both did a solid job this season, and they picked up some really quality wins through their tournament runs. So the NESCAC being up there, I think, is one of those things that in a way, I think we always kind of expect the NESCAC to be up towards the top, but at the same time, this year with the way the league was, there felt like there was more parity within that conference, and as a result, we knew again they were good, but them advancing as far as they did, I think, was certainly a testament to the top of that league. And then, yeah, as you look further down, I mean, there were some really strong leagues that, put multiple teams in. And, I think a lot of leagues, picked up some quality wins. I mean, the MIAA, obviously, Hope making the run that they did, Trine winning the game that they did. Like, those are solid performances for those conferences, and great things to see too. Because again, it's tough. It's tough to put multiple teams in the tournament. It's even tougher to have multiple teams win at least one game in the tournament, much less have one of them, advance to the second weekend. So yeah, these teams in this list are certainly amongst the stronger, especially as you get towards the middle. The CCIW stands out there, the NUMAC. So yeah, good stuff there.
The only conferences to have multiple teams in the tournament but not win a game. Do you know the two conferences?
It's a good question. I do not.
One was the MIAC, who had Gustavus and Concordia Moorhead in, and they both
Yeah.
lost their first game. And then the other one was the Northwest Conference, who
Right.
had Willamette, Puget Sound, and did they have a third in?
Well, I mean, Puget won, but
Oh, that's right.
they beat
So I must have
Carroll.
something. I have something off there, but yeah, the MIAC was probably the most disappointing conference.
Right. Yeah, I mean,
they're hoping for one win at a minimum.
Right. Yeah, both of those teams, I think, certainly had the potential for a win. Neither getting is disappointing there for sure.
Best region performances, Region 9 just obliterating everybody else, led by Whitewater and Wartburg, but also other teams as well won multiple games. Region 8, I think actually they probably expected more, with Carroll going out in the first round. And did Milliken win 2 games? 1 game?
Yeah, Milliken lost to Whitewater in the second round after being Willamette.
And Illinois Wesleyan, did they? I'm
Illinois
trying to remember.
Yeah,
who were
Illinois
the other
Wesleyan
teams that won?
Yeah, Illinois Wesleyan lost to Wartburg after winning there, so they lost in the second round to Wartburg. So,
well, and if I have that Puget Carroll game wrong, then I might have regions 8 and 10 off also in this slide. But probably a disappointing tournament for Region 10. Now,
sure.
it's a little bit hard to say, since most often they are facing each other and someone has to lose the game. Whereas in Region 8, none of them were facing each other, especially in the first round, and unlikely in the second round. So it might be a little bit artificial to say with Region 10.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we had one pot of just all Region 10 teams, which didn't happen anywhere else in the country. So you have 3 teams that their seasons were going to end within that first weekend in Abilene. Right. And then on top of that, the Northwest Conference teams got flown to really tough pods. I mean, credit to Puget for winning that game, but I think it's even understandable there too, because it's not exactly an easy draw for Willamette to have to go play Milliken, who, Milliken's been so strong over the course of this entire year. So yeah, I mean, I think that explains a little bit of Region 10 there too. And almost like an asterisk there with, the fact of them all playing each other. They're going to pick up losses and not going to most likely have a winning record. So,
yep. On to committee trends. One thing that we saw was it was very hard to overcome both a bad SOS and low wins VRO. We saw that with both with Skidmore. I think Arcadia had a pretty decent SOS, but Skidmore is the one that comes to mind, where Loris was in a really tough region. I don't think it was necessarily a really poor resume that kept them behind Concordia and Stout. They, they had a worse resume because they had very good resumes in front of them. But I found it interesting that the committee was willing to say, hey, you might have a pretty good looking win percentage that's higher than everyone else at this table. But if both of your other main criteria, well, I'm calling them main, there are 3 of the 5 primary. But if your SOS and VRO are both not great, it made it really hard, or whether or not it made it hard for them to select them, they decided that resume didn't match up. And I think that made a lot of sense. and it's something that I would have done as well. I still think the committee was very consistent and predictable. Regional rankings were more or less what I was expecting, and the Pool C selections were very close to what we were expecting, and the bracket hosts were also very close to what we were expecting. And I think that's always great so that coaches have some assurance when they're going to schedule. And then I
Yeah.
thought it was interesting that the committee was willing to have two teams sit at the table for every round and not pick them. That did not seem to be any sort of a factor for or against a team. They were just trying to say, hey, what do we think is the best resume based on how that we have ranked all the regions, set the top 16. Yeah.
I really like that they took that approach too. I know it had been kind of mentioned that there was some thought that maybe if a team was sitting at the table for quite a few rounds, then they might be more inclined to select them to the field. That was not the case with this committee, at least. And I think it speaks to the fact that again they were evaluating the criteria evenly across the board. Um, they weren't leaning towards anyone that had been there longer than others. And so as a result, that's what we want out of the selection process. We want them selecting the best teams via Pool C. It was somewhat surprising, but at the same time, I think everything that we've been hearing was that your strength of schedule, your VROs were going to matter a whole lot. And honestly, you need to win a lot of games too, but winning a lot of games without having those quality results to go along with it was not going to win you many points as you were sitting there at the table. And honestly, I didn't really ever see a path where Skidmore was all that close. Again, I wasn't in the room, you weren't in the room, but we were going through that mock selection process, and it certainly seemed like Skidmore was at least the third best team at the table in almost every round. And again, I think that just is a testament to the way the committee's evaluating criteria now, as opposed to several years ago, where maybe Skidmore would have been picked because of that win percentage. Now the emphasis on the SOS and VROs is showing up more and more each year, I think.
Yeah. Looking at the demographics of the Pool C, this is all 21 teams. Just looking at their min, max, average, and median criteria. I think this is a little bit misleading since it includes like those top teams usually have really, really good resumes that
Right.
aren't really Pool C resumes, if that makes sense. But the median win percentage is over 800, and I mean, if you hit those median marks, you will absolutely be selected. 815,
Yeah.
564, 4-3. But I guessed at who the last 10 Pool C teams were. And I don't think these numbers would change very much if I only got 8 of the final 10 right. But I think this is a lot more of an example of the type of resume that you need. That kind of 770, 550 with 3 wins VRO. If you can hit those, I think you've got a very good chance to be selected. And so if you're looking at those minimums, the team that had the minimum winning percentage, 680, I don't know if that, I mean, that was Wash U. I don't know if they had also that max SOS and the max wins VRO, but those things often will go together. That max winning percentage might have been with that min SOS or min wins VRO. So,
Right.
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was done.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was just gonna say, I think that you hit well on the median there, because I think that's what you need to be looking at. The minimum, maximum. I think those are typically teams that are in different cases. I mean, WashU being in the UAA 100% helped them there because their SOS was so strong. I would say very, very few teams that I can think of off the top of my head could be sitting there with a 680 win percentage and still get selected, outside of a UAA team, right? So, but I think those median numbers, if anything, for people out there watching, for coaches out there watching, like it's not all that hard to get to a Pool C viable resume. Now, if you're in a strong region, that median resume may be a little tougher to get you into that Pool C conversation early enough. But I think in a lot of regions, that 778, 554, if you just rounded even like a 780 win percentage with a 560 strength of schedule and you win 3 games VROs, like that's going to be a resume that's well rounded. And I think if we saw anything from the committee as well this year, it was that they do prioritize the more well rounded resumes, which includes the VROs, as we saw. And so if you have a well-rounded resume, like that's what you need to be going for, because the really high win percentage or really high strength of schedule, but not having both kind of as a little bit of a middle, it doesn't seem like that's a resume that's as likely to be selected at this point. So even if you went out and played a really, really strong schedule, but you didn't win more than, you know, win percentage was less than 700, I think your chance of getting selected is going to be that much more tough.
Yeah, that's about 21 wins. So 21-6 is kind of a common Pool C kind of resume. So then looking at bracketing, I thought it was really creative. We didn't have pods of death, which are we definitely could have had from regions 7, 8, and 9. Examples of this are Oshkosh hosting a pod, but being in the Bowdoin quadrant, and Wartburg hosting a pod, but being in the Rhode Island quadrant. In a past bracket, it probably would have been likely that we get Wartburg versus Oshkosh instead of Wartburg versus Bates and Oshkosh versus Smith. And those are far more interesting matchups that we got in the Elite Eight than we otherwise would have gotten. We were still limited. Well, the bracketing was still limited by the NCAA. So we saw that with sectional hosts, both on the men's side and the women's side. Geography was the deciding factor in where the sectional host was. So there is definitely a limit to the flights that the NCAA is going to pay for. And then we also saw that if a host was blocked by their this year the men had priority. So if the women's host was blocked by their male counterpart, the committee went to the next best overall seeds. So we saw teams like Washington and Lee and DeSales, who are probably around that 17th and 18th overall seed. They got the nod to host rather than whoever would have been the 2 or 3 seed in the NYU and Catholic pods. And those 2 and 3 seeds would have been, roughly like team 28 or team 40, versus
Right.
team 17 and 18. And that's obviously the philosophy that the committee has gone with. I think you can argue wanting to favor your top seed and not put them in a pod with a strong overall team and also potentially have to face them at home. I think it's also really, really cool for a school to host a sectional. And I would rather have overall team 17 or 18 get that reward than overall team 28 to 40.
Right.
Those are completely strong arguments that are completely opposed. And
Yeah.
I don't think that there's a right answer. It just depends on the thing that you want to prioritize. And I think both of them would be good things to prioritize.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a tough deal because, on one hand, I can totally see it, and in going to the 17th and 18th makes a lot of sense. I think from the standpoint of the fact that those teams feel more like hosts, right? So versus having the pod at a 2 seed, as you talked about, Scott, where it's clearly the number 2 seed, but it's still hosted there. I lean more towards this hosting at the 17th and 18th seeds, but I think the one thing that we saw was like in the case of Washington Lee, right? Like Catholic playing Washington Lee in the second round, that's a matchup you expect a little bit maybe further on. Just from the standpoint of the fact that it was played at Washington Lee, which I know wasn't taken super well. I think it was understandable, but it was also Washington Lee was a really, really good team. I mean, it was a one of the tougher pods that I think we had just with the quality of those 2 teams. And I have no doubt that either could have made a run in the tournament, but it's there's no good answer to it, right? But I think the committee did a good job of yeah, trying to put it at schools that were in position to host, right? So if you end up 17th, you were right there on the cusp of hosting. And I think maybe that was the thought process in trying to reward some of those really strong resumes rather than creating the pods, putting them at a school that wasn't in the hosting conversation, but got there because of, either A, geography, or B, in this case, obviously with the men getting priority on the first weekend.
Yeah, and obviously, as a committee, you cannot guarantee that your highest seed in every pod wins 2
Right.
games. But if the higher seed, and I am saying that Catholic and NYU were the higher seeds in their pods. If all the higher seeds made the Sweet 16, your top 4 overall seeds were going to host sectionals.
Yep.
And I think that's the main important thing, because that means you are guaranteed to have the Sweet 16 game, and if you win the Elite 8 game, at your home court, and those will almost definitely be against very strong teams. It's not that DeSales and Washington Lee aren't strong, but hopefully you can seed it in such a way that it's not too brutal facing
Yeah.
the second round. But I I liked how the committee was like, "Hey, we're gonna do the best that we can. We can't guess upsets,
Yeah.
and set it up so that our clear 4 overall number 1 seeds will host sectionals," which is really the most that they can do, right? Like, Stout winning and pushing the sectional away from Transylvania. Like, if I think it was Johns Hopkins and whoever did Scranton play Ohio Northern?
Right.
Um, if Johns Hopkins and Ohio Northern had both made the Sweet 16, Johns Hopkins probably would have hosted that sectional, and it would have been very similar to the Transylvania situation. And then in the top right Bowdoin quadrant, if Baldwin Wallace and
Mhm.
Messiah had won, then it would not have been at Bowdoin.
Yeah.
And so,
Exactly.
like, those are not carbon copy, but very similar situations to the Stout situation that just didn't happen in those quadrants because they were very unlikely.
Yeah.
And but the committee had set it up so that, hey, like, NYU and Bowdoin did end up hosting because it fell mostly chalk, and it just didn't happen in the Transylvania quadrant.
Right. I mean, and the committee did everything they could do, right? That whole thing, it was the committee had no fault at all. I mean, they set it up, and there was only one situation with the Transylvania pod where Transylvania doesn't host. And I think that's all you can ask for from the committee, right? I mean, you're looking multiple rounds deep in the tournament, trying to figure out. They can't predict the upsets, right? And so, there was 3 teams in that Carroll pod that if any of those 3 win, Transylvania is hosting.
Mhm.
Obviously, Stout was the one that won. At the end of the day, as I would, and I've said plenty about this, but I would love to see those number 1 seeds be guaranteed the opportunity to host. At this point in time, though, that wasn't a possibility this year, right? And so I think the committee did the best that they could in trying to set it up that way. And yeah, I mean, credit to the committee for trying to put that together. I thought the bracket was really well done. I mean, you have it up here on the bullet points, but it was very creative. We saw some great pods set up, and they were still able to put it in a situation where they tried to get it again to where those sectionals were held at the top seeds.
Yeah, like a Whitewater, Stout, Wartburg, Oshkosh sectional would have been just so boring for,
Right.
like, all of the teams and all of us watching. I mean, it would have been great basketball, but we've seen all of those sorts of matchups many times throughout the year. And seeing the matchups that we did were awesome. So moving on to the year in stats, some of the top freshmen. This is, I think, sorted by average points and rebounds on a minute basis and filtered to players that played at least, I think, 10 minutes a game,
Yep.
roughly speaking. So obviously it's more impressive if you can do it over larger minutes. But I had to sort it by something, and we saw, like, some post players like Lexi Harris and Jolene Lusk have tremendous impacts on their teams. I was very impressed watching Kendall Harris play. Obviously, is it Reedy? Jamie Reedy?
I believe it's Reed, is
Reed.
what I've been
Uh,
told.
she was very impressive as well. And Calvin, after graduating, I think just about every starter is really starting to build something with freshmen and sophomores who played a lot of minutes and were quite good. Um, and so there's obviously many more names on the list. If there's any that you want to comment on or freshmen that aren't on this list, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great list to just look at, kind of break down. Obviously, Lexi Harris was so good for WashU, and I think she's gonna be a big part of what WashU does moving forwards. I think we had an idea that she was gonna make a pretty big impact for them, but what she came in and was able to do, not just at the beginning of the season, but over the course of the entire season, even through UAA play, was really impressive. Ballard from Cal Lu, I thought she really stood out. Maybe didn't get as much attention out there on the West Coast, but I thought she was a big part of what Cal Lu was able to do this season, and they had a fairly successful year based on kind of past years. So that's a great player to have in your program, right? When you can have a freshman come in and make the impact that she did, and players can be around for several years, kind of moving forwards. I would even say too, like Webster, right? I mean, you see some of these programs on this list, programs that are going to be losing key talent from their senior classes. So it's really good to see a freshman performing this well, gaining that experience, someone that can really take charge heading into next year. And there's multiple instances of that as you just kind of look down this list of the teams represented here. And I would even go down and say, Madison Williams, at Hardin-Simmons, like Hardin-Simmons will be losing some top level talent from this year's team. And she's a player that could really make an impact moving forward. So yeah, there's a lot of players in this list that I just thought really stood out in one way or another. And ultimately great to see for these programs that are going to need to have their, the impact of their freshmen a little bit more as sophomores next season.
I think eyeballing this list, it looks like Washington and Jefferson's the only team represented twice on the list,
right?
Based on where I just decided to cut the screenshot off. So moving on from top freshmen, we'll look at the oldest teams. This is only roughly the top 130 teams in the nation, and all the teams that made the NCAA tournament. But this is a minutes. Well, let me check. It's either a points weighted or a minutes weighted. Year. It is a points weighted. So this is a scoring weighted class where 5 is a graduate and 1 is a freshman. So on a scoring weighted basis, Pacific was older than a senior. So we obviously don't know if seniors are returning for a 5th year, but I believe Pacific has a good amount of graduate students that can't play for a 6th year. I believe Marymount has some as well. And so I would imagine a lot of the teams on this list will be losing some significant talent. And it's not a surprise that it includes a lot of our top teams, including, I think, 2 of our Final Four.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and we see every year, I think the more senior laden teams will be the teams that are able to navigate the NCAA tournament a little bit better, reach the second weekend of the tournament, reach that Final Four. So yeah, I mean, I think that certainly stands out. A team like Transylvania, Rhode Island College, NYU, Whitewater, obviously Aaliyah Grundall, not having her. I mean, it was talked about by Coach Corallo in the post-game press conference after they lost. Like, you can't replace a player like Aaliyah Grundall. And so they're certainly going to have that hole to fill. So it'll be interesting because, I think too, at the same time, some of these programs have found a way over the last couple of years to really get their younger players to step into a little bit of a better role. I mean, even a team like Hope, right? Like a team like Hope was on this list last year. I would think. I know we kind of went through this last year, and Hope made it to the Sweet 16, right? I mean, they found a way to do it despite the inexperience. So I'll be interested to see how some of these teams moving into next year, how they kind of adapt to this, I guess. And so, yeah, I mean, definitely some older teams that were making runs in the tournament, and some fifth years on all these rosters that are going to be missed, and leave some holes behind within their starting lineups.
Mm-hmm. Next, we'll look at strongest conferences, which is going to look fairly similar to the strongest conferences in the NCAA tournament. But this is looking at your non-conference winning percentage and the average Massey ranking of the teams that you beat. So both, did you win a lot in non-conference, but were those teams any good? And it's no surprise that the WIAC just absolutely dominates this list. They are far and away first. They both won the most games and against by far the strongest
Yep.
competition. But the NESCAC and the UAA, like, it's not like we talk about the NESCAC and their single round robin and the UAA spread across multiple regions. Those are absolutely benefits to those conferences that other conferences currently do not have. That said, they go out and win games in non-conference against good competition. Like, they are a strong conference, who definitely also have some advantages that help them with their resumes. But they easily second and third. The CCIW was awesome this year. CC would be Centennial, I believe. So they won a ton in non-conference, not against the strongest competition, but they won at such a high clip that by my homegrown stat there in the final column, they ranked pretty high. And then Northwest Conference and ARC also rank high. I was surprised to see the SCIAC
Yeah.
at 8th. They won a lot of games and against pretty strong teams as well.
Yeah, that's great to see from them. I mean, and a lot of parity within that league this year, which made it fun. It was interesting because I think they were a deeper league than they have been years past, and their performances in non-conference play certainly showed that, right? So I think we saw that. Great to see from them. Yeah, the Centennial, obviously, with Gettysburg, Johns Hopkins, even Dickinson there, early on especially, was a really solid team that was making noise within kind of the national conversation, top 25 discussion. The CCIW to me was just an outstanding league this year. I thought there were some teams that really took good steps forward. I mean, Elmhurst with what Jason Pruitt did there as head coach. I thought North Central looked a lot better this season. And those are all teams that, I think we knew Illinois Wesleyan, Millikan, Carroll would all be pretty strong. But I would even say that in a lot of cases, those teams exceeded at least my expectations. So, yeah, nice to see a team like that, or a league like that, I should say, with the CCIW certainly trending upwards. And I would think that's kind of going to continue into next season. A lot of return talent on a lot of those rosters, even as you look towards the middle of that league as well.
Carthage, too, was quite
Right.
good.
Right.
So then we're going to look at the preseason D3hoops.com top 25 in hindsight, which is kind of going to add little context to my preseason top 25 that I'm going to post at the end of this presentation. And just shows how we don't know very much and so much can change. NYU and Transylvania were indeed up top. Tufts opened the year number 4 in the preseason top 25. Did they go to the Elite 8 last year?
Yeah.
They did not go to the Final Four, but they're in the Elite 8, returning almost everyone, and they had a tough year. And then Trinity, Connecticut, Trinity, Texas, and Ohio Northern all started the year pretty high on the list and then dropped off the poll for a while. And then we're playing some great basketball late in the year. And then 6 of the preseason top 10 teams ended up in the Elite 8. So most often, the teams that end up doing really, really well don't come from too low down the top 25 list, but it obviously can happen. But here's the top 25 in the preseason with their number of losses. So, we were definitely thinking that Tufts and Babson would be able to replicate what they'd done. Did we know Babson's coach? We know Babson had their coach had changed by the time the preseason poll came out.
Right.
Ohio Northern was a tough one because they had a key injury that I'm not sure was known when we were voting in the preseason. And a lot of times if you don't know, you're going to pick a team that either did well the year before or has a history of doing well, which doesn't always mean that they have the same caliber year, but it's usually a pretty safe bet.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, Riley, but it's just interesting to look back and see how teams can change a lot.
Right, it is, and obviously you have the teams that really started high and just kept dropping. The ones that honestly interest me as we look back was a team like a Trinity, Connecticut that you talked about it a second ago, but I mean, I think we all thought they were going to be a top 5 team, and as it turned out, they never quite got back to that spot, but they did find their way back into the top 25. They ended up fairly high in my ballot as we got towards the end of the year. I thought they were a really strong team. Obviously, tough first round loss there in the tournament, but they were a team that had a chance to make a tournament run, I think. And just that NESCAC schedule, they took some losses and struggled. But they were able to come back. And I think Ohio Northern, again, you brought them to, like, the injuries are going to play a role in this, right? And I would say same with Trinity, Texas. Natalie Anderson went out, and with her on the floor, maybe Trinity does stay right
Mm-hmm.
around that 12 to maybe 20. They were certainly gonna have some more inexperience, but I thought, as it turned out, Trinity ended up being really solid, and they did it without Natalie Anderson on the floor for that second half of the year. So just interested to see some of those teams. I think, again, injuries at that point in the year are always going to play a role. And I think more so in Division 3 than at the Division 2 and Division 1 levels, with such little time between the preseason and the season actually tipping off. I think a lot of times we'll see some of these teams that do end up being pretty good, just taking a little bit of time to find their way and get into a rhythm, especially if they did lose some talent. And so it doesn't mean they're not going to be good, but I think when you drop out of the poll, we see a lot of changes between that preseason poll and then the week 1 poll that's voted on 3 weeks later. And it's tough if you drop further down to climb your way back up, even if you start playing better. And so I think we saw that with a few teams this year as well. And the preseason is just so hard to know, right? We don't know a whole lot about all these teams until we actually see them on the floor.
Yep. So then we're going to look ahead to the next year. This year's not done yet, but we are going to start looking ahead while we have everyone's attention before the Final Four happens. I was hoping to go through these bullet by bullet, but here they all are. So there are some key changes happening to the Division 3 landscape next year. The Pool B bid will be going away in women's basketball, and that is because the CCS, their 2-year waiting period will be over, so they will have an automatic qualifying bid. So the number of Pool C bids is not going to change from 21, but there will be no Pool B bid. There will be, what's that math? 43 Pool A automatic qualifying bids instead of 42.
Yep.
So that's one change there. The C2C and the ASC, I believe, are starting their 2-year grace period where they retain their automatic qualifying bid, but before the 2026-2027 season, those conferences will need to get enough members back to keep that automatic qualifying bid. Otherwise, they will lose it. But if any point before then they get back over the requirement, they will keep their automatic qualifying bid. And I think all of us are very interested. You probably more than the rest of us, being in Texas, Riley, are interested to see what happens with the ASC and the C2C. As I only know about Division 3 basketball, but there are many more athletic implications of those schools not having an automatic qualifying bid across sports.
Right. It's going to be interesting to follow. I mean, even as we sit here right now, I don't think that there's really a clear indication of the path, particularly for the ASC. The coast to coast, we know Regent University has expressed interest and would like to probably join the coast to coast. So, or join Division 3. It's expected that they would be a part of the coast to coast conference. We don't know any of that for sure, but that's kind of the developments that we've seen on the ASC front. We really don't know at this point. It's going to be interesting, being that in Texas, there's not really another league that a lot of these schools could just easily join at this point. The SCAC is pretty full as is. The SAA is already adding Trinity, Texas, and Southwestern. So it's going to be interesting to follow. I mean, we'll certainly keep an eye on that.
The MIAC is currently at 12 members. So that means each member plays a double round robin 22 league games out of 25 regular season games. But that's going to, I forget every time, is it 19 or is it 18?
I believe it's going to be, I believe it's going to be 18. I'll do a check real quick.
But the cold math is that the more league games you play, the more your strength of schedule is pulled towards 500. And that's because if two teams play, one has to win, one has to lose. The average winning percentage there is 500, and that becomes the SOS for each team based on that single result. And the more results that you have between teams in the same conference, the more everyone's SOS is going to be pulled towards 500. And so the MIAC playing significantly fewer league games is going to mean that their SOS has more of an ability to deviate from 500 depending on how they schedule in non-conference. In the 3 non-conference games this year, Gustavus Adolphus scheduled almost as hard as you can. And it was only able to pull their SOS up a small amount. If they continue scheduling hard with their additional non-conference opportunities, they really now will have the ability, they have the freedom to craft a much stronger resume than they've been able to craft before. And that applies to every team in the MIAC. I think that even beyond Gustavus and Concordia, teams like St. Benedict, St. Catherine, and Bethel are strong basketball teams. There's, very good basketball being played in the MIAC. And I think it's going to be more obvious from their resumes next year because of the decreased number of league games that they are playing and the increased number of non-conference games.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that'll certainly be something to keep an eye on there. We'll see. I think it's going to help a lot. I think it's going to make Region 9 really interesting because for quite a while, the MIAC has been hurt by that league schedule. And at this point now, they're going to have more of those non-conference opportunities to do more things. I think we can see their resumes really get a lot better and maybe even get to a point where, we'll see if it's this year, maybe in a couple of years, where the MIAC has 3 teams regionally ranked, right? And that'll be interesting to see that dynamic along with the WIAC and the ARC, because those 3 leagues right there are amongst the strongest leagues in the country. I mean, we saw it just with that slide a couple of minutes ago. And so that's going to be a really tough, it's going to make that a tough region that much tougher with the MIAC just having more non-conference opportunities. And therefore, I think more opportunities to have teams regionally ranked.
100%. John Carroll is moving from the OAC to the NCAC. So the OAC currently has 10 members. So they will, unless there's other changes, go down to 9, which means that every team in the OAC will play 2 fewer league games next year than they did this year. They already have the ability to craft a strong strength of schedule and strong resumes, and they do. But they will have even more freedom to do so. Even if it does mean more work for the coaches, right? More games that you have to fill on your schedule, but they have more freedom. The NCAC will go from 8 to 9. So actually both the OAC and the NCAC will have 9 teams. So that means less freedom for NCAC teams to build a strong resume. And so it might be a tiny bit more difficult next year. And we might not see as many of their teams regionally ranked and close to the regional rankings as we did this year, because they might all be, 8 to 15 points of SOS lower.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that'll be interesting again within that region. I mean, I'm looking forward to seeing how that dynamic plays out. And with 9 teams in the conference too, that's interesting concern. We often see even numbers. Obviously Wabash is a men's league school there in the NCAC, so that makes it a little bit different from that standpoint. But yeah, with John Carroll joining, it'll make the OAC interesting too, I think, because even though John Carroll hasn't been as much of a factor in recent, this past year, John Carroll had been a strong program in years past. And
Mhm.
so, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, and possibly maybe, the OAC, uh, teams continue playing them in non-conference, and we'll see how that benefits them. But yeah, you're right on the SOS point there.
Both Fontbonne and Northland have made announcements recently that might put athletic seasons next year into some jeopardy. Um, Looking only at the implications on Division III women's basketball, the SLAC has 10 teams right now, and if they end up only having, well, not regardless of how many they have, they might play fewer league games next year. I don't think that that would really change a whole lot of the fortunes for those teams to get a second team into the NCAA tournament unless they drastically change how they schedule in non-conference. The UMAC has 8 teams, could potentially go down to 7, depending on what happens with Northland, which again, depending on how they schedule, could change the SOS of those teams. And a lot of teams in Region 9 play UMAC teams in non-conference, and it might have a small potential benefit to your SOS from playing a UMAC team as opposed to years past.
Right.
And then a couple provisional members move to full membership. So Asbury and Warren Wilson, I believe, become eligible for being regionally ranked and postseason play next year. And then Hartford and Lyon move up a year in their provisional status, and now games against Hartford and Lyon count for all your NCAA primary criteria, whereas this year games against them did not.
Right. Yeah, it's gonna be interesting. As we continue to add schools to the Division III ranks, it's good to see, because obviously, with two schools in jeopardy of maybe not even be able to play next season, it's nice to see that there are schools now that are transitioning over to becoming full members of Division III. Hopefully, kind of keeping those numbers within the total body membership consistent. I think at this point in time, that's nice to see, and hopefully can continue. So we'll see how that plays out. Obviously, neither of those two schools that are in danger of possibly not having athletics next year are necessarily powers by any means in terms of the Division III women's basketball landscape. But nonetheless, as you mentioned, Scott, we may see a slight impact on some of the teams that are within their own conferences if they do not end up taking the court.
And I have my own agenda here by talking about all of this strength of schedule stuff, because I think it's important to point out what a big impact the number of your league games has, for
Right.
better or for worse. And I think it's helpful for people to be really aware, like, oh, this is why every year Gustavus is not going to host, and Concordia maybe sneaks into the NCAA tournament or usually misses it in
Right.
past years, even though most of us were voting both teams into the top 25 and quite high. Like, we saw the basketball quality was there. But there are things, statistical things about your NCAA resume that can hold you back that are not your fault.
Exactly.
Looking at some top graduates. So all of these students are listed on their school's roster as a graduate. Now, I have no inside knowledge. I don't know if they're listing it as like meaning they have graduated, or it does it mean they have no more years of athletic eligibility left or not. I have no idea. But I would assume that the vast majority of this list are done playing college basketball, and it's just tremendous talents
Yeah,
throughout this list that you can really never replace. Um, but I wasn't planning to call out anyone specifically, but it's just, very, very good players who have had long and great careers.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, these are all players that are going to be, that have incredible parts of their programs, and whether they've been there for a year as a grad transfer or they've been there for all 5 seasons, they're going to leave behind a pretty big impact. And certainly, they'll be tough players for these programs to replace, especially the programs that have, two on this list, right? So it'll be interesting moving forwards because again, these are players with the level of experience they bring along with the incredible talent. Yeah, they're just such big parts of what a lot of these programs do within their playing styles on both ends of the floor. And so, yeah, just a great list to kind of look at and see, all these great players that, most likely are going to be leaving, the college level after this season.
Another thing to point out as we look at these graduate students is if a school either doesn't have any graduate programs or has very limited graduate programs and currently has seniors playing on their team, those are the types of players that you could see transfer elsewhere in Division Three or out of Division Three. But looking at a player on this list like Morgan Morrison coming from Smith, I believe Smith has limited graduate programs or none. I don't know the specifics. But like that's the type of school that you might see lose a senior who ends up still playing Division Three basketball at a different school. Whereas teams that have or schools that have robust graduate programs, and NYU is a great example there, have a lot of extra ability to attract those student athletes for their grad year.
Right. Yeah. And as we look into the last year of the grad year next year that we were talking about, or the fifth year senior, as we were talking about earlier on, yeah, it's going to be interesting because this is kind of the last chance for a lot of these programs to really build through these grad transfers. They're using their COVID year to play another season. So yeah, it's certainly one of those things that's been talked about a lot in Division Three because I think more so at this level, we have a lot of schools, some that have really strong grad programs with a lot of different options, and those that have pretty limited grad options, if none at all. So yeah, certainly something to keep an eye on because we can see some players, not necessarily players on this list, but some players that are really good at one school this year and end up playing at another school next season. So even if they are a senior and they leave the program they're currently at, doesn't mean they're necessarily done playing at the college level.
Yes. All right. We are 3 slides from home. So our youngest teams, again, this is only looking at roughly the top 130, 140 teams, but like, be scared of a team like Washington University, who was in the tournament and they did lose in the first round, but it was a very, very competitive game and they were seeded well. They were at least I think a 10, maybe,
Right.
maybe an 11. They're a strong team and they are very, very young.
Yeah.
Other teams that pop out, let's see here. Who's the next? DePauw would be the DePauw and Hope, actually, the two that faced each other are also very, very young. Southern Virginia, Trine, those are both in the tournament. And I mean, did Southern Virginia play NYU?
No, Millsaps played NYU, but Southern Virginia played at the same. They played at DeSales.
They played DeSales, and I thought that they played great. They pushed
Right.
DeSales pretty hard in that game, and they were not just a 14 or 15 seed happy to be there. They were a very competitive team that played well. And then there's, other teams high up on this list that didn't make the NCAA tournament, like Denison, Colby, and Calvin, but who all had bright spots of their year, even with how young their rosters were. And there's just kind of a fun part about sports that there's a cycle and you get new schools cycling to the top of the division every year.
And I would just add in that if you are a coach or someone out there that has something to do with scheduling for a team, be looking at this list because these are going to be the teams that moving forwards are going to be in position to be regionally ranked, most likely, because these are, teams like WashU, Denison, Colby. They're going to be teams that are going to be factors for a couple of years to come because of all the young talent they have that will continue to mature over the course of their college careers over the next couple of years. So I know scheduling for this upcoming season is probably just about done for most teams. But heading into the following season, these might be some teams you might want to try to get on your schedule if you want a regionally ranked opportunity, because I could see several of these teams ending up regionally ranked for the next couple of years.
Yeah, like I think WashU, Colby, Stevens, Randolph-Macon, Guilford,
Yep.
Berea, Gettysburg, Cal Lutheran, all of those teams are probably locks, or I mean, we can't say locks, but
Right.
very likely to be regionally ranked for the next 2 years.
Yeah.
Also looking at the youngest regions, I think region 6 and 7 will advance in their strength beyond where they are right now. And then regions 2 and 4 especially, but also regions 3 and 5 might kind of hold steady or move back a little bit as they lose a lot of really strong talent. Again, depending on recruiting and transfer classes that we have, at least I have zero knowledge about at this point in time.
Yeah. Yep.
And then the last slide is my way too early top 30. And so this is the result of a model, and I did not manually move any teams around, but it's based on your winning percentage and strength of schedule this year and how much of your production that you are returning, and a really, really tiny weight on the height of your team. But really, really tiny because you can succeed being a little bit shorter than average. But that's in there a little bit. But this was also youngest regions, youngest conferences. The UMAC's really, really young. CCS, USAC, some interesting conferences there that maybe had very few teams, if any, regionally ranked, but I think could be pushing some teams into the rankings next year. But here's my way too early top 30. Again, this is all just based off of a model because I was looking at it and I was like, Warburg 13th, I would have put them a lot higher. But they do lose Macy Harris, which is a really big loss.
Yeah.
But here's the list. If anything jumps out to you, Riley, you are welcome to comment on it. But hopefully no one takes a screenshot of this. Otherwise, it's going to look really silly in about 6 months.
Yeah, I think that's the thing to know is, yeah, I mean, we still got Final Four games to play, right? So this is definitely a way too early top 30, and that's why it's described as such. But yeah, I mean, a team like Oshkosh, I think could be a lot better than 21. Middlebury is interesting. I think they could be really good next year, honestly, with some of the players they have coming back. Shrine is another one. Obviously W and L. It's interesting seeing Gettysburg where they're at. But I can certainly see it, right? I mean, I thought Gettysburg was really, really strong this year. And with some of the players that they're likely to bring back, they could be a number one type team. What's interesting is, and it'll be interesting heading into next season, but if, in from what we understand, NYU is going to lose some significant talent, and Transylvania will also lose some significant talent. This year, it felt really easy to just pencil in NYU and Transylvania, at least for me, in my ballot. I'm not sure it's going to be the case next year. I think I feel like we've had it a little bit easier on the women's side to some degree. The men's side, it seems like that number one, number two is changing every single week. And so far this season, I mean, that number 1 and 2, top 3 even, it just felt really consistent. And we'll see heading to next season if maybe there's a little bit of a change of the guard almost with some different teams kind of getting into the mix there in the top 4 or 5 spots.
Right. And this is, again, based off of what the rosters say, but looking at graduate and senior production, Trinity of Connecticut, Transylvania, NYU, Smith, and Rhode Island College all return fewer than 50%, whereas a school like Gettysburg is returning 95%. So yeah, it'll be very interesting to see what happens. We will get a lot more trickles of known graduate returners. Like, for example, we know that Wartburg is returning just about every senior on their roster for a grad year, which is a large reason why they are where they are. Otherwise, they would probably be below Transylvania, to be honest. But it's a good pick. And then we had one question, which was, what's our regional rankings for regions 7, 8, and 9? And I think you'll just kind of have to, for next year,
Yeah.
take a look at this list and eyeball those teams. So like I think Region 7 is going to be a very strong region with DePauw, Hope, Trine, Baldwin Wallace, like are the main four up top. But then there will be very strong teams behind them. Region 8 could be pretty interesting. So like
Yeah.
Illinois Wesleyan and Carroll are the top ones. I have Wash U as the third, and then all the way down to Transylvania, because it must mean that Milliken has a lot of senior or grad production. And then in Region 9, it would be Whitewater,
Yep.
Stout, Wartburg. So pretty similar-ish top three, and then Oshkosh as the fourth one on the list. As I believe Gustavus, Concordia, Loras all have some pretty significant experienced talent that may not be back.
Yeah, and like Milliken will be interesting with Elise Knutson. My understanding is that she has another year. The question is obviously if she's gonna, if she's gonna use that extra year and whatever. So because if she's back for Milliken, I think that would change a lot for me at least as a voter. So that'll be information that will be helpful to know by the time we actually go around, in October, whenever it is, and start voting on these things officially. But yeah, because those will be some interesting things too. If teams bring back a player for a fifth year that we might not expect, or teams lose a player that we don't necessarily expect, those can also obviously play a role in all of this and the way that teams end up kind of ordered within a ranking.
Yeah. Well, thanks everyone for watching. I know I love interacting with the Division III community. It's fun talking with parents and broadcasters and coaches who are also close to the programs that they follow. And I'm much more afar from the programs, but I love being able to provide information or color where it's helpful as people follow the sport that we love to follow.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things that I was just telling someone the other day. Like, even though we're about to head into our off season, there's still a lot of conversations to be had, a lot of things to kind of break down and look at. It's always a lot of fun, just this community that we have with D3 hoops, and it feels like on the women's side, just more and more kind of attention is being given towards what a great level of college basketball this is. So it's a lot of fun to be a part of it and follow it all. And yeah, certainly appreciate everyone who tuned in.
See you all later.